and welcome to episode 225 of the Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies for the casual spike. This week, it's just me and Devon. We got hosts dropping like flies. Devon, joining me from Western Massachusetts, it's d00mwake.
It's me. What's up? We apparently got a lot of people on the injured reserve list this week, so it's me and Dave kind of filling in. So yeah, we got some fun stuff to talk about today, though.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, on this week, we lost Stan to some kind of random sickness. We lost Shane to some kind of injury. Imagine how bad that injury must be to stop you from podcasting, which is, you know, as we know, the most physically demanding of all the media properties. And we almost lost Devon too.
He must have broken his wrist or something.
Yes, at least, maybe both. You can't click a mouse with no wrists. Am I right?
That's true.
Yeah, that's what I tell people for my job all the time. But at any rate, on this week's show, we're going to keep focusing on Pioneer because of two things. Well, number one, we got to talk more about the hype deck at the moment. It's the hype deck of the moment across all formats, I think, really, and that is Boros Convoke. Right, Devon?
I thought you were going to say Mono Green Devotion.
Oh, nobody's hyped about that. Even people who are masters of that aren't hyped about it.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, you're right. This deck is everywhere. There have been some, there was a week on Twitter last week where there have been some extremely hot takes, some hot, some lukewarm, some people comparing it to the next Hogak. I think I land somewhere around the middle. We'll talk about that, but yeah, it's been everywhere.
Yeah, and absolutely, and many people probably know Devon, one of the early proponents of this deck in Pioneer, doing well with the deck here and there. So good to get into it, dive deeper into it. Since the last time we talked about it a couple weeks ago, we really only talked about it for about 10 minutes to give an intro to. That was the start of the hype. Now we're very mid-hype, and a lot of the hype matters right now because we are running up to Dreamhack Dallas for the RC Pioneer and Dreamhack Dallas this week, and Devon will be going.
Yeah, I'm going to be participating in the last chance qualifiers. For some reason, I keep telling myself it's a good idea to travel, an extended distance, to places, to tournaments that I'm not qualified for. But, I'm going to have a great time. I'm going to stay with Spike over the weekend, and it'll be a good weekend regardless. So,
well, tell Everett that we said hey for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, we got to get you guys both on a show sometime.
That
would be pretty fun. Just get everybody together. Maybe we could do it for the maybe Lord of the Rings isn't the best time for us all to talk together, but we'll find some time. I think it would be a good show. Get 3 or 4 of us together in a room talking about how bad and weird cards are.
The mashup.
Exactly. So before we get into all that, let's do some housekeeping first. So no new Patreons or patrons or Patreons or whatever we want to call them these days. So if you would like to support our podcast, please go to patreon.com/thedivedown, where you can check out all of the different tiers, benefits that we offer to people who support the show. We just sent out a bunch of swag. If you think you're owed swag and you live in the U.S., please let us know. We're still working on EU, non-U.S. stuff, but please reach out. We got new buttons. We got new tokens. We have deck boxes. We have playmats. We have all the stuff that people have been enjoying from the podcast. So hit us up if you would like to do that. Number one, the main thing that most people I think enjoy about supporting our Patreon, though, is getting access to our Discord. $1 a week gets you access to the Discord. Dive down. Patreon.com/thedivedown. If you want to support us without going through Patreon, you can check out our store. That is thedivedown.com/store. Just go check it out. Get a hat, get a fanny pack, whatever. Fanny pack, the fit for the summer, I've heard.
Yeah, I mean, you can't go wrong with the fanny pack. Also, the Random Boy shirts, I gotta get me one of those.
Everybody. Oh, Devon, we got to comp you one of those. I'm going to get your address after this and send you one if you want one. I totally forgot about that. We haven't even sent you one yet. If you'd also like to support us via playing Magic, you can check out manatraders.com to rent cards on Magic Online. Our code there is thedivedown.com to get 10% off your first 2 months of rental cards at manatraders.com. Manatraders, of course, the way that I got the cards for this deck, the way that I believe Devon gets most of his cards from Magic Online. Is that right? You rent, right?
I've been a subscriber, I think, for over 3 years now. It's an amazing service. Would highly recommend.
Absolutely. Yeah, I remember we really couldn't do this show without Manatraders, and I think many content creators are kind of in the same space. So thanks to Manatraders for that. Barrister Man is back for one more ride with us. We're going to talk about beards at some point later on. That is the Dive Down M23 if you would like to get 15% off your first order from Barrister Man for grooming, facial care, beard products, shaving products, soaps, all kinds of cool stuff like that. And finally, if you want to help out our friends at Nerd Rage Gaming, order a little bit of online cards from somebody, you can use a code. It's Dive8 to get 8% off your purchase. And we don't even get a kickback from that. It's not, we're just, want to help out fellow Chicagoans, basically. Devon, thank you for being patient during housekeeping. I know it seems to get longer every time.
No, I'm here. I'm here whenever I can, say something and throw something in there. I'll be happy to. So
yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's just dive right into Boros Convoke. We don't need to wind it up. We don't need to do anything. This is the deck that everyone wants to talk about. Literally, it's a in my business, sometimes you call this an omni-channel campaign. Every single thing you turn on, every content creator you turn on, it's like Big Convoke is out there paying for all the influencers right now because it's the only thing anybody wants to talk about, so it seems. And deck is interesting, right? You were alluding to kind of what happened on Twitter this week. Why don't we start off with that?
Oh, it was a wild ride throughout the entire week. I think it's like first day. I forget exactly the first post that I said. It might have been after Sodek had won the challenge. Right. And, I don't remember him saying anything along the lines of, I don't think he mentioned the H word, but other people were talking about it and, other people tweeted and they said that, this deck that feels like Hogak, nothing could beat it. There was one tweet from, I forget exactly who it was, but they tweeted, they thought that they needed like emergency auto include of Fury and Solitude into Pioneer to fix the problem or ban something. And I'm just like, come on. And
I know.
And at the end of the day, the deck is good. It's very extremely powerful, but it is wildly inconsistent. And it's just, I don't know, it's just another aggro deck, it feels like to me.
Yeah. We're going to get more into that as we talk about it because I certainly have some thoughts too. But I actually loved the people who were already kind of like selling short on the deck. So CCR from the Magic Grindcast was kind of like, I tried it. Here's a screenshot of my 1-4. I don't think I'm going to go back. And then, Jessie Robkin, friend of the show, also had a couple of funny tweets. One where she had said, she said something like, "Hi, I'm here to inform you that the Hogak deck or the Boros Convoke deck was a 1 week long social experiment. You now can stop playing it." Basically, I don't know if that meant that she thought it was good or bad or just wanted people to stop playing. But I will say, the deck is everywhere, right? It's everywhere. You played the Pioneer Challenge today. How many times did you play against it, do you think?
Well, I played the deck. I didn't play the mirror once.
You didn't play the mirror once? Oh,
no, surprisingly. The challenge that Sodek won, he played a mirror in the finals, and I actually looked at the challenge results from yesterday, and there was one in top 8, along with, I think, another 1 or 2 in top 32. So, yeah, people are definitely playing it. It's, I've seen screenshots of people who played against the Convoke deck like 5 times in the same league, so there are lots of people playing it, and it's definitely all over the place.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about what it is. Enough with talking about the discourse around it. So you said Boros Convoke, aggro deck. That's where we are right now. Boros Convoke, it's an aggro deck. If you haven't played against it, we'll talk into the mechanics of how it works. But it's essentially a combo synergy-based aggro deck, let's say, right?
Yeah, using the word combo actually, I think, more accurately describes what's going on here because, you have a lot of column A and a lot of column B, and you're trying to, assemble a little bit of A and a little bit of B. And I get a lot of affinity vibes. Where you remember old school Affinity where you had like your payoffs, which were Plating and Ravager, and then your enablers, which were like Memnite, Ornithopter, Moxamber. It has a lot of that same vibe to me.
Yeah, it's funny. I didn't think about that until I was starting to read, I think both Frank Carson in an article on Channel Fireball and Sodak in the write-up that he made on Mystical Teachings, mysticalteachings.com. I believe that they both said Affinity, and it was kind of like a light bulb went off for me because I had played the deck in a League Plus at that point and was kind of like, what does this remind me of? Because I kept thinking that it reminded me of 8-Whack, but it's really I'm a little bit on the line there. Like, we'll talk about kind of thoughts about that some more, but I do get the Affinity vibes because of that enabler plus payoff kind of vibe with the deck.
Yeah, and then the other comparison to Affinity is, you have your Ornithopters and Memnites, which help discount your, if we want to go really far back, Mirror Enforcers and Frogmites, but they're very similar to your 1-drops, which enable your Mirror Enforcers and Frogmites, which are the Captains and the Loxodons.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So I think we've done the setup here. It's an aggro deck. If you're interested in aggro deck, and it's super powerful deck. It's explosive. It puts 10 plus power on the board on turn 2 quite often. But let's talk about how it does it.
Absolutely.
Devin, you want to take us through the core of the construction of this deck?
I would love to. So the kind of the step 1 here, which is we'll call this part A. This is the artifacts. So you have 4 Ornithopter, 4 Thraben Inspector, 4 Voldaren Epicure. Those are essentially what we call the core of the deck. But those are essentially, non-negotiable. You can't cut any of those because they are what enables your fastest starts alongside Gleeful Demolition. And then, so you have consider those the enablers, and then you have your payoffs, which are the Convoke creatures, the 4 Venerated Loxodon, and 4 Knight Errant of Eos, And then alongside I guess you could also include Reckless Bushwhacker into the payoff, even though Reckless Bushwhacker is not usually going to be a turn 2 play unless you maybe have some other stuff going on, but it's it is a payoff in the sense of it pays you off for having a lot of small creatures in the battlefield, which Gleeful Demolition also does as well.
Yeah. So just to point out what's going on here, really just like, let's talk about it at the highest level.
Okay.
When we say artifacts, we got our Ornithopters, that's clear. Thraben Inspector, Voldaren Epicure, these cards, they're not super powerful cards on their own, except for the fact that they generate 2 pieces of cardboard for a single mana, right? And what we're really trying to do here is we're trying to get cards that put artifacts into play via creatures for low mana cost on turn 1. And that's why this deck has Thraben Inspector and Voldaren Epicure in the deck. And honestly, those 2 cards, there's not many things that really have done that better in the history of Magic in a lot of ways, other than other 0 casting costs things, right? Like this kind of 1 mana card puts a 1/1 or a 1/2 into play and then drops this artifact thing as well is, I think that's something that we've done a good job of identifying over the last few sets ever since Thraben Inspector has been printed, that's a powerful thing that can happen and a lot of synergies can come out of that.
Yeah, and the really nice thing about the Thraben Inspectors and Voldaren Epicures, not only do they provide you an artifact to turn on Gleeful Demolition, they also are bodies themselves to help you convoke out the Knight Errants and the Loxodon. So it kind of, they essentially, they're almost a 2-for-1 in that regard, where,
right.
You're not getting a direct card off of, like, if in the longer games, sometimes you end up sacrificing the Cleaver, sacrificing the Blood, so Epicure is not a direct card, it's filtering, whereas Thraben Inspector is just a literal, I've called it Ancestral Recall before, it might as well be at this point. I had, side note, I had a screenshot of a Vintage Cube deck the other day that had Thraben Inspector and Ancestral, and the caption was, "I thought you couldn't have 2 Ancestral Recalls in your deck." So,
that's pretty good. I mean, it is worth noting. I mean, the idea there that these cards are 2-for-1s in this shell is kind of what it is, right? Like that. Yeah. That's what it is that they're 2-for-1s in this shell, and that's what when you take a high synergy card like that, it's all about putting it in the shell that gets the most out of it and turns something that seems like a marginal benefit into an actual card. Like that's what we're working on, and the way that we do that, like Devin said, is we're going to play Gleeful Demolition, and so you probably know what this card is. I'm gonna give you the high level of what it is for the listeners here. This card is a single red. It's a sorcery, and it says destroy target artifact. If you controlled the artifact, put 3 1/1 goblin tokens into play. I'm not reading the actual text of the card, so don't correct me.
No, that's exactly what it is.
From memory. Yeah.
You got it. Perfect.
Are they Phyrexian goblins? They're Phyrexian goblins, right? Something like that?
I think so, because there were the all will be one set, so I think they are Phyrexian.
Yeah. They're twisted.
For
They're
your
not your
Phyrexian
daddy's
tribal
goblins.
decks.
Yeah, exactly. So this card, I think people, as we talked about when we looked at this deck a couple weeks ago, the high-level version of this deck, this card is extremely familiar to people who've played Modern or have played since the last time we went to Mirrodin, essentially because it's Kuldotha Rebirth with a twist, right? It's got the Phyrexians instead. I think Kuldotha is sacrifice an artifact. I don't think it's destroy an artifact.
Yep.
But which is a nice thing to keep in mind. If you have to destroy an artifact, you can do it with Gleeful Demolition.
Which actually does come up quite a bit. I've killed my fair share of Reckoner Bankbusters, and also Torrential Gearhulk is an artifact.
Yes.
So,
that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, killing that for 1 mana feels really good.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the card that really has you catapult forward. All of a sudden, you can put together, we'll talk about big sequences, but the idea here is you play one of the other 1-drops, where you play an Ornithopter, and then on turn 2 or sometimes turn 1 in combination with Ornithopter, you cash that in to make 3 1/1s. Now, high level.
So, and the cool thing about Gleeful Demolition, if you want to go super old school, it almost acts as like a dark ritual of sorts, where the turn that you want to cast the Convoke creature, you're spending 1 mana to put 3 bodies, and that 3 bodies is essentially 3 mana's worth of card on the Convoke turn. So,
Yes, that's the key, really. You got the boons on the mind, Devon. You're talking about Ancestral Recall. You're thinking about Dark Ritual. We're going to talk about Giant Growth, Healing Salve, and Lightning Bolt soon as well.
Lightning Bolt and Pioneer?
In my Pioneer?
I know.
We can only hope. But it is a good point, because it's not only just about having a bunch of 1/1s attack, and that's what the payoffs here are all about. The payoffs in this deck are those Convoke cards. Knight Errant of Eos, which draws you cards, and then Venerated Loxodon, which buffs your whole team. And this is really the thing that made this deck possible at this point, right? Is the fact that we got a redundant 5 mana cost Convoke card.
Yeah, with only 4 Loxodons, I feel like people have tried Venerated Loxodon before in various iterations in Pioneer, and myself included. I've tried a couple of times with that card, but it feels like you said, it just never really had that second payoff piece. And if you look at, if you want to go back to the comparison of traditional Affinity, that deck was extremely powerful because it had multiple payoffs: Arcbound Ravager, Cranial Plating, stuff like that. And that's where, once you have that redundancy, that's where you really get to the more powerful starts, because you have those draws more consistently.
Yeah, we call that the Rule of 8.
Yep.
Actually, you know who calls it that? The Rule of 8 is Frank Karsten, who we'll be talking about here sometimes as well. Yeah, we did not make that up. No TM there. I have my own terrible rules that we've TM'd in the past. The only card that's left here is, of course, Reckless Bushwhacker, which is a great card. I think in the right shell, of course. Again, this gave me the 8-whack vibes, because I actually had some fun with that deck occasionally in Modern. It's just pure aggro. This is the thing that turns your tokens in one way into a whole bunch of damage really, really fast. The thing that's interesting about Bushwhacker is that it sort of crosses it's more of a Loxodon than a Knight Errant, right? So it's something that puts more gas in the tank as opposed to something that gives more card advantage. But I do think it's a similar power level to Venerated Loxodon in some ways, because the game just ends so fast after a lot of these Bushwhacker turns that I do think this deserves to be kind of thought of as payoffs 9 through 12 in the deck. It's not lesser necessarily.
Yeah, 100%. Like, the biggest comparison of if you mentioned Venerated Loxodon to Reckless Bushwhacker, the thing about Loxodon is you have to take the turn off to cast it, so you're not getting in any damage that turn. But
Right.
Bushwhacker is usually the card that ends the game on the spot, because you're getting that mass burst of damage that turn. Whereas Loxodon is okay, it's more explosive because you can cast it on turn 2 and actually benefit off of casting it on turn 2 most of the time. But it's not going to, you're giving your opponent that one turn window, and it's not going to end the game on the spot similar to Bushwhacker. So it's that's kind of the big difference there.
Yep. So that's the core. Nobody has any controversy about these cards being in this deck, and that's a lot of a deck.
Well, I have seen people. I don't know how deep you want to go into this. I've seen people cutting Reckless Bushwhacker from their deck.
Really? I have not seen that yet.
Yeah, there's not too many people that are doing it, so I didn't want to write it. I didn't want to put it in the notes. But there was a couple of people who I saw doing that. I would not recommend that, but
Interesting. What were they playing instead? Can you just give us a high level of that? Was it more utility cards, more token generators, or?
I cannot remember the name of the card for the life of me, but it's the Mutate card. So it's red-white for a 2/2, and then it's Mutate for red-white colorless, and when you mutate, your creatures get +2/+1 until end of turn.
It is called Regal Leosaur. Is that right?
That's the one. Yep.
So this is a card that, it's interesting you bring this up. So Frank Karsten mentions this in his article on Channel Fireball at the end of it about how to play this deck on Arena, because Reckless Bushwhacker does not exist on Arena.
Right. Yep.
So do you think that people were just going for this card because it's even more power? Is that kind of where it's coming from? So it's a similar effect, but they're just trying to add even more power to their creatures. So what do you think?
So I think the concept behind the Mutate card is you don't need an additional spell to be able to turn on Surge. Right, so because there are frequently spots where you're top decking, and Bushwhacker is obviously not a good top deck because you need another card in hand. But the Leosaur is a much, much better top deck. So when you're like maximizing for the lower percentage of your draws, you could make an argument for the mutate creature. But when I build decks, especially in a format like Pioneer, where the speed of the format is significantly faster than Modern, at least right now, and just a lot more people are doing more linear stuff, I'd rather build my deck in a way that maximizes the top percentage of my draws. And we'll get into that in our maybe our next discussion a little bit. But yeah, that's how I tend to build my decks.
Did you just say Pioneer's faster than Modern?
Oh yeah. 100%.
Wow, that's so interesting.
100%. I
haven't ever thought that could be possibly true. Maybe it is true.
Well, and I think part of that is, like if you look at, I don't know how far we're going to want to go into this, but Modern pre-MH2.
We got all night, Devon. We got all night. It's a holiday. Tomorrow is Memorial Day.
That's fair. So
I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Yeah.
Well, Modern pre-MH2 was a lot of, the people's complaints were a lot of two ships passing in the night, which I agree with. The format was not great. And kind of the way to break that up was Fury and Solitude, this free interaction. And when you're introducing more free interaction into the format, the more linear decks are being answered on turns 1, 2, and 3. And just in a general sense, that means that you're going to play more turns over the average course of the game.
Right. That's interesting. I sort of thought of it more like we're getting the same number of turns, but more interaction per turn because everything is cheap/free, right? So it's like the individual turns are more complex in Modern, but it still felt like it's kind of like we have the same-ish number of turns, but I could be wrong about that. But I hear what you're saying. It's the power of the interaction for sure. And Pioneer really doesn't, I mean, that's one of the consistent concerns about it. We joked about Lightning Bolt. Lightning Bolt will never be in Pioneer, but like this idea of you have your fingers crossed. You'd like Lightning Bolt in Pioneer?
I think I would. I would at least try it,
Interesting. It is my favorite card. But a lot of people have that complaint about Pioneer right now where they're kind of like, if you want great interaction, you have to play Fatal Push, and then people build decks to make Fatal Push not good, and it's like, where are we going with this kind of whole thing? But interesting. Okay, so that's the core, except for a couple of true freaks out there taking Reckless Bushwhacker out of their decks. And that's a lot of cards in the deck. If you look at that core is, it's 24 cards between the artifacts and the payoffs, and then 4 more for Gleeful Demolition. So that's 28 cards total in a deck that has 41 cards, at least in your build. So it really doesn't leave a ton of space. It's basically another pack of payoffs almost to fill up the rest of the deck. So what is the rest of the deck?
Well, let's get started with, I think, probably the most controversial card, which, in my opinion, again, I can go on record and say this, I think you should play Burning Tree Emissary. But there are a lot of people who disagree with that statement. But for those of you who don't know, Burning Tree Emissary is red-green hybrid X2, so 2 mana 2/2, and then ETB you make red-green. Now,
here's your Dark Ritual, Devon. This is the Dark, or your Manamorphose, kind of, I guess.
Well, I think that my biggest comparison with Burning Tree Emissary, if you want to go back to the affinity, is Frogmite. Right? Frogmite was a really unassuming card for a lot of time. People didn't even play it. Like if you go way, 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 way back to like during the Mirrored and Darksteel days, but a lot of people didn't play it. But then people quickly realized that you just want it adds more redundancy, right? It adds more to your explosive draws. It's not the most. It's not the flashiest card. It's a 0 mana 2/2. It's not doing a ton. But what it does do, and again, this was going back to the way that I tend to build my decks, is to maximize the top percent of your draws. And I think, especially if you're playing with Reckless Bushwhacker, we've seen this in the past before, a Tarka Red, where they were playing, a bunch of red 1-drops, Burning Trees with Reckless Bushwhacker, Tarka's Command. And Burning Tree just makes those Reckless Bushwhacker turns so much better. And the other really important thing is with Convoke creatures, it lets you have these like lines where you go, say, a Thraben Inspector on turn 1, and then on turn 2 you go, say, Burning Tree Emissary into something else. Then you can still use, because it's a free spell, you can use the mana left over to still have enough to convoke a card. So I really think it helps you in a lot of your busted draws. Yeah.
For what it's worth, as someone who is, clearly on the casual end of the casual spike spectrum as we think about it here, feels like a no-brainer to me, especially even after playing this deck. Sometimes you do get those kind of mopey draws, or mopey, not draws, but like mopey cards 7, 8, or 8, 9, and 10 off the top of your deck, where you accidentally draw 2 Burning Tree Emissaries and you don't get a Bushwhacker, and you're kind of like, or like, this is the top deck after you've been swept, and you're kind of like, this isn't doing that much for me. But on the other hand, I can't imagine that I would want to pass on the explosiveness of this card to do something else. Like, I don't know what I would put in here instead. More token generators. I saw, for example, like Sodak is into, I always forget the name of this card because it's pretty recent, but it is called
Resolute Reinforcements.
Resolute Reinforcements,
I knew
which is essentially what's that called? It was like
Raise the Alarm.
Raise the Alarm. Thank you so much. It's Raise the Alarm, but it's got a body. It's a creature instead of just an instant. Is this the main other option, you think, when people are considering not playing?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So the kind of the argument against Burning Tree Emissary is so Resolute Reinforcements, I will agree, is a fantastic card. It offers you a lot of different things. It's a creature that can be found off of Knight Errant, which some other token generators can. It has flash, which is massive in the post board games against sweepers. You can just hold up, if you're like, you go nuts on turn 2 and then you don't want to commit more to the board on turn 3, you can kind of just like attack for a bunch, get swept, you don't care, end step, cast this, and then easily rebuild really quickly. Mm-hmm. But the biggest downside of Resolute Reinforcements, and the reason that we're playing other token generators over it, is because you can't cast it off of the red-green from Burning Tree Emissary. Right. So you don't really want to have a lot of like, you can't, when you're playing Burning Tree, you really can't afford to play white 2-drops because those, again, can't be cast off of Burning Tree Emissary.
Right. And that, even the other card that Sodak is using and that other people are using, you even have as a 1 of in your deck, and he is recommending 3 in his version of this deck, is Clarion Spirit, which is another 2-drop to consider. Now, this is a card that I got to admit, I sideboarded out a lot, and we can talk about that a little bit more when we get to flex area, but it's a 2/2 for a generic and a white. It's a spirit, and it says, whenever you cast your second spell each turn, create a 1/1 spirit creature token with flying. So essentially, it feels like Sodak is like pushing more of this deck towards white as opposed to red. I think when you start to think about the way that it's actually behaving, like using those cards, being sure that the tokens that are being generated can make Knight Errant or a Loxodon on their own without having to be having to have a white land in order to make that happen, because that does happen a lot in the build that you kind of recommended, and the one that Frank Karsten also is playing at this point in time too.
Yeah, I like the first copy of Clarion Spirit. As you'll notice, I have 1 copy in my most recent list, and I think it's like really cool as a 1-of, because I think it's very good in the mirror. The fact that it makes a flying body, because the mirror, I don't know if you've played the mirror match yet, but it gets really weird sometimes. You're both kind of just like staring at each other. Nobody wants to make an attack because they're like, well, what if I just get infinite attack on the next turn?
I will say the combat math abilities of the people I played in the mirrors with this was surprising, because I had a lot of people who were just like trying to alpha me, and it's like they didn't count the damage that they were going to do, or the number of blockers, or what I could do on a crackback if I dropped a Bushwhacker, or if I managed to, get a little bit tricky and had certain cards that I'm pretty likely to have in my hand on turn 3 or 4, you know what I mean? And I guess some people just want to make you have it, when they're playing decks like this. They're like, you just got to have it. But it happened in 2 different matches that I won, where people alphaed into me, and then I was like, well, okay, I have 2 life left, and I'm going to hit you for 17 on the crackback because you're completely tapped out. Like, I think, note, and we can talk about this more a little bit later too, but like, when you're playing a deck like this, it does not mean that you have to like attack all in even at the earliest opportunity you have. Like, do the math. Do the counting and make sure you're going to win, you're going to survive, or whatever. But anyway.
There are frequently spots in this deck where you have to do math like 2 to 3 turns ahead of time. Like, you have to think about how much damage am I getting through this turn, how many blockers are they going to make next turn, what's next turn going to look like, and so on. It's just you have to play so many turns in advance with some hands. But Yeah, going back to the Clarion Spear, I think the awkward part about it is, again, as you said, can't be cast off Burning Tree Emissary. Also, even not just can't be cast off Burning Tree Emissary, but also really awkward with Emissary, even on turn 3, where you say play your third land, and then you can use 2 mana to play the Burning Tree, and then you have a white left over for the Clarion Spirit. Because Clarion Spirit says second spell, not spell cast after Clarion Spirit, you typically will want to play the Burning Tree first, in which case you're not going to get a token that turn off Spirit. And I think it also exposes you to spot removal more. Like, this deck is incredibly good against Fatal Push. Every single card is either 2 creatures or replaces itself in the form of Inspector and Epicure. And this is the only card that, like, unless you have exactly Ornithopter on turn 2, if you cast it against Rakdos, they're just going to kill it, and you can't afford the trade cards like that against Rakdos.
Yeah, totally makes sense. The other thing that really surprised me about this, and I have to say, surprised me specifically about you, given some of the other conversations we've had, is you can't play Gigantha if you have Burning Tree Emissary, and you love your elk friend.
Oh, I do.
I was surprised that you were kind of like, yeah, it's not worth it in this case. I tend, like I said, I tend to agree, but did you have to think for a minute to decide whether having a companion in this deck was possibly worth it, or is this just not the type of deck where you think you're ever going to use that as a mana outlet?
So I hope Gigantha is not listening to this podcast episode right now, but forgive me. The thing about Gigantha in this deck is you're a 19 land aggro deck that stops at 2. Like, your curve literally stops at 2. Bushwhacker's a fake 3 because it costs 2.
And your 5-drops are not 5-drops either.
Right,
so.
Exactly. So because your deck is incredibly low land count, you stop at 2. You also have a ton of things to do with your mana already. You have clue tokens, you have blood tokens, you have Castle Embereth. So I don't find myself short on things to do with mana. And on top of all that, I think that if you're ever in a spot where you're picking up and casting Gigantha, you've probably already lost that game.
Yeah, totally makes sense to me. Sorry, Gigantha. There's plenty of homes for you. Our friendly 5/5.
Just not this one.
Just not this one. Exactly.
Maybe in another life.
I mean, who knows? Maybe we'll get a different card that just literally casts Dark Ritual, but it's red or something like that, and then we'll be happy to play that instead. It only costs 1 red or something. All right, so like we said, this leaves... So now we said that left 13 cards. Now we're down to 9 cards left in the deck that aren't really... Because I sort of consider Burning Tree Emissary to also be core to the deck. It's like, it's free real estate, honestly. Like, I don't totally understand why... I mean, Sodek's way better Magic player than I am, so, like, have your opinions. But, like, I prefer the speed, I guess is what I'm saying. So what are we doing with the rest of the cards in this deck? Like, what holes are we trying to plug? What are you thinking about when you're picking the rest of those cards? What's on your mind?
So as far as the flex spots are concerned, the next most common one is Forbidden Friendship. So this is, for those of you who don't know at home, it's red and a colorless sorcery. You make a 1/1, I believe it's white soldier, and then 1/1 red dinosaur with haste. So 2 1/1s, one of them being red, one of them being white. For the most part is a 3 of, I think, I would probably say it's about like 60-40, 60 play 3, 40 play 4. But it's nice because for a couple of things, as we talked about with Burning Tree Emissary, you want things that you are able to cast off of red-green, and your deck has a lot of red 1-drops and a lot of white 1-drops. So typically you're not going to be able to go Burning Tree into 2 1-drops. You just can't do that with the way that your colors are sorted. So it's nice to have a card that you can cast off of Burning Tree that adds 2 more bodies to the board in those draws where you're playing Convoke creatures. That's the really good thing about it. Some people have played, I think it's called the Goblin Instigator, which is red and a colorless 1/1 ETB Mega Goblin. That card is potentially better because you can find it off of Knight Errant. The problem is the white creature that you make off of Forbidden Friendship is so important because if you go, you can imagine turn 1 Voldaren Epicure, turn 2 Burning Tree, you have 2 red creatures in play, and then let's say you play Instigator, you now have 4 red creatures in play. If you have an Ornithopter, you don't have a white creature for your Convoke creature. So the white creature is very important in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. But the key thing is that the next thing you're thinking about with this slot is, and everybody seems to be thinking about, is what's one more token generating card that I can get in this deck? Whether you choose Goblin Instigator, like you said, which I played against in some of the mirrors, whether you choose Forbidden Friendship for all the reasons that you just talked about, you're not going to play the reinforcements card that we taught, Resolute Reinforcements, along with Burning Tree Emissary. But that's what's on everybody's mind is like, I want to get another card that puts 2 tokens onto the battlefield. That's the next thing I need to do because makes Convoke better, makes Bushwhacker better. It's just a no-brainer, right? To just get a little bit more token generation in.
Yep. Exactly. And then moving on to the next flex spot, we'll kind of group all these together as we'll call them the one drops. So the first one is Legion's Landing, which is, no, I wish it was a creature, but it's a white for an enchantment, which when it enters the battlefield, you make a 1/1 vampire with lifelink, and then it flips into a land that you can tap for white or pay 3, tap it to make a 1/1 vampire with lifelink. The other one drops here, we have Legion Loyalist, which is 1/1 haste, and then it has the battalion trigger, and then the last one is Giant Killer. So there is kind of a split. Most of the lists that I've seen have been, at least the recent ones, and what I'm currently playing is a split of 2 Giant Killer, 2 Legion's Landing, and no Legion Loyalist. The earlier list did have Legion Loyalist because you would think, you're making a bunch of tokens, you're always going to be able to trigger Battalion. The ability on Legion Loyalist comes up sometimes, like it's important in the mirror because just to give your stuff first strike, it makes their blocking impossible if they ever want to have some sort of blocks. It's very important against Greasefang, so their angel tokens can't block, so you can like just tank a hit from Greasefang and then have Loyalist to make it so they can't block with their stuff.
Right. Which, by the way, I found I've lost to Greasefang twice across 2 leagues because the angels just sit there and you can't get through them. So I totally understand the attraction of that.
Yeah, and there's like that turn you go for a push, but if you're going for a push with a Convoke creature, they can just like trade off the angels for the Convoke creature, and then if they ever, to prevent the most damage, then if they have a way to get to part healing again, then you die. But the problem with Loyalist is I think it's not great in your bad matchups. It's not helping the matchups that you are already good against. Right, like you should be favored against Rakdos, but Loyalist is not good against Rakdos, so it's making that matchup worse. So I think I tend to lean towards Killer and Legion's Landing because those are both incredible against Rakdos.
Yeah, and the reason that they're incredible against Rakdos, one's a removal spell, right? Or it taps something down, which is actually the first time I've used an activated ability to tap down something, I don't know, since I played Limited, like, 5 or 6 years ago, to actually have a tapper that was helpful came in occasionally. And also, Cut Down is that what it's called? Is it called Cut Down? The flip side of Giant? Chop Down. That's what it's called. Chop Down. That's right. Cut Down's a different card. That's in Standard right now.
Yeah.
Giant Kill, it's not an efficient removal spell, but like Adventures do, all of this stuff stacked together along with a 1/1 turns out to be a card that's valuable. And since you can search it up off of Knight Errant, occasionally that comes in handy and all those kind of things. Legion's Landing is a little more interesting to me. It's about the grind, right? Is occasionally just making tokens if you get in a situation where you can't. I mean, it's slow, right? You have to be playing in a pretty specific matchup to have that be that helpful, right? Rakdos. Although I suppose against Control, Rakdos, like you said, maybe Control too. Yeah.
Yeah, when I played an RCQ last weekend with this deck, which I don't know if I mentioned to you, but I lost in the finals. And
I did not know you lost in the finals.
I did, yeah. I beat Rakdos 4 times throughout the day between top 8 and Swiss, but then I got by green in the finals. But every single time I flipped Legion's Land against Rakdos, it was just like it was insane because the thing is post board they have to kind of play. They can't. So Rakdos is a really good deck because it has the ability to like just kind of race other people with the Bloodscythe Harvester, Trespasser, Shieldred draws. But the Rakdos player playing against the Boros deck doesn't really have the luxury of just kind of playing a curve of creatures because you're under the gun, right? So you have to play in a different manner, which allows Legion's Landing to, like, if you ever flip that thing against Rakdos, it buys you so much time because every single chump block against, a Graveyard Trespasser or Misery Shadow just gains you an additional life and you're taking no damage, which buys you the time to amass this resource of, just a bunch of stuff in hand and a Bushwhacker for one big final push. And that's exactly how the game's played out. And Landing is amazing against them.
Yeah, that's awesome. So side note, so when we first talked about this deck a couple weeks ago, like I said, you were kind of a little bit feeling like we needed to solve the Rakdos matchup in order to prove that this deck had a place at the table. Kind of, do you remember saying something like that? Do you feel like, do you feel like, was it adding more Legion's Landings and Giant Killers to your previous build, or did you just play more and realize that the deck was better against Rakdos than you initially thought?
I played more because it must have just been a small sample size because I have been really beating Rakdos with this deck
Yeah.
over the past like week or so. Like I said, I beat it 4 times in the RCQ. I think I beat it 3 times in the challenge today. I've been crushing Rakdos with this deck. So
that's very interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, if the field at Valencia, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is any indication, Rakdos is not going anywhere. So having a deck that's good against Rakdos is potentially a good thing.
I will say, I think, part of that is because people still haven't adapted their sideboards. One thing that if you're looking to, if you want good sideboard cards against this deck, you cannot get away with just playing 4 mana sweepers. You have to play 3 mana sweepers. Hidetsugu, Consume, Salt, Brotherhood, Sin, etc., etc.
Yeah.
If you think that you're on the Rakdos side of things, and you think that, I'm just going to fix this Boros matchup by adding like the 4th Extinction Event to my sideboard, it's not going to cut it.
Yeah. What do you think about people playing like Illness in the ranks because it says tokens on it?
I don't want to play against that card, but I think it's too narrow.
It feels too narrow to me too. It feels like it's not useful against anybody else ever, so it seems pretty hard to fit. All right, so those are the 1-drops that we've talked about. We talked about all that. I think we've talked about most of the flex options now, with a couple of exceptions of kind of like the high end of the spice scale. Right. So these are the things that you've been trying out. Maybe I've been trying out. It's because I had a list of yours from earlier this week. The cards here on your list, let's talk about the first one, Throne of the God Pharaohs. So this card is a 2-mana artifact, right, that says at the beginning of your end step, deal damage to target player equal to the number of creatures you have tapped.
It might be lose life, but it's one of those two.
Okay.
The only 2 copies I have a German one and a Russian one, so I don't know how to read them. So
yeah, I know that feeling. Shane has an entire mono green Tron deck in Russian he is one of his pride and joys because he used to be a Tron person in Modern. But Russian, they look cool.
They do.
But so this card, I see it's not in your current version of the list. It's not being picked up by a ton of other people. What did you think about this? What do you think the role of a card that's this spice level being in the deck is?
It's really hard for me to say because I don't think I've cast it a single time. Like the times where I've put it in my deck, it's only been 1 copy and it's just never come up. I've never drawn it. But the theory behind it is, so first and foremost, again, going back to the Burning Tree Emissary line of things, you want stuff that you can cast off of red-green mana, and this being a 2-mana artifact fits in perfectly with that. Yeah. So that's the nice thing about it. It gives you more stuff to do with your Burning Tree turns, and being able to push through damage when the board stalls, like you can use your Convoke creatures to tap 5 things, play Luxodon or something. Even if the counters on the creatures are not going to be able to make you attack next turn, you're still getting in 5 damage that turn. Also with Ornithopter, you can attack impededly with Ornithopter, get some damage there. Giant Killer as well. You can go tap your own thing and then get 2 triggers or 2 creatures tapped for the throne. So you get some cute stuff that way, mostly for board stalls, but it's just it's never come up for me, so I've decided to remove it. But I feel like it would mostly come up like in the mirror, I think. Question mark.
Interesting. What about, so before we talk about the other one that's on your list here, I'm looking at Frank Karsten's list from Channel Fireball, and he has Embercleave.
Oh yeah, I didn't put that one down. That's a good one to talk about.
Embercleave is a sweet card that we haven't seen in Pioneer in a little bit. What do you think about throwing one of these into the deck?
Well, it's funny because I read Frank's article before our show, and I think he mostly, he made a little comment in there about how he just incessantly loves Embercleave, so he just wants to put it in every deck. Yeah. And it's weird for me because a lot of your creatures are really small. You're making a lot of 1/1 tokens. Yeah. So the weird part about Embercleave is like, it's good in situations where you're attacking with 4 or more creatures, so you've probably already the Gleeful plus Convoke turn. Like you could imagine a scenario where you do the turn 2 Gleeful Demolition plus Convoke creature, turn 3 you have 4 creatures plus a 4/4, set up the Embercleave. But my issue is it seems win more to me because in those situations, if you're attacking with all of your creatures, they're either killing your 4/4 or they don't have a removal spell and they're just losing to the board anyways. So it's just, I don't know. I've tried it, but I haven't really had too much experience with it, but it feels like a lot. It feels win more to me.
Yeah, I think after thinking about it a little bit, it does feel a little bit win more just because of the fact that you only have 8 good targets for it. And those targets are the targets that they want to kill with spot removal anyway. So it's a really difficult kind of like needle to thread, I think. So one thing that this card does is it gives a little bit of evasion. If you're in a state where there's a lot of things to get through, your cards don't have any evasion generally in this deck. So it gives trample. That kind of counts. The card that you have on your list,
speaking of trample,
also part of that idea is evasion too, right? So Devilish Valet. Yeah.
This is evasion to the next level, as it were.
Right.
So this is Devilish Valet. Now, for the listeners at home, you probably don't know this card, so I'm going to read it to you. It's 2 and a red for a 1/3 with trample and haste, which is 2 important keywords, and especially in this deck. And whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you double its power until end of turn.
Right.
So there's some cool lines here. Now, on the at the base, just Devilish Valet plus Gleeful Demolition. That's it. You now have an 8 power trampler because it triggers 3 separate times. So you go 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8. So just Gleeful Demolition alone makes this an 8 power trampler with haste. You can imagine getting to these, like, go even deeper. Then you follow that up with an Ornithopter. You now have a 16 power trampler. So you can kind of see it's not that hard to make this just lethal in one shot. And that was kind of the theory behind it. In practice, being a 3-drop is the most awkward part about this. As we said, over the low land count, Dex curve mostly stops at 2. I think it might be like fine as a 1-of when, like against something like Mono Green, where they put like a Cavalier of Thorns or just a bunch of blockers and you can one-shot with them with this. But in the other theory was it being a 1/3 means that it dodges Bone Crusher Giant, and its creature type means that it dodges Power Word Kill against Rakdos. So
that was interesting. Idea. Yeah. Yeah, well, another line I was thinking about with this was just with a Reckless Bushwhacker.
Yep.
If you were to go like Ornithopter into Reckless Bushwhacker, it doubles up a few times, plus it gets the buff, so it gets even bigger kind of more quickly as well, which is interesting too.
Yeah, and with Bushwhacker, you can stack the triggers. So you can actually give it the Bushwhacker pump and then double it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Triggers. Gotta love them. Gotta understand your trigger stack, people, if you want to play Magic. All right, so we've talked about the construction of the deck. We'll get to the sideboard later on. It does feel like one of those decks where like consensus with a few outliers is pretty close to, like we said, it's like 80% of the deck, 90% of the deck most people agree on, but we're having a lot of fun with the other things that are there.
Yeah.
Let's talk about playing this deck, though,
okay,
because I think that's the thing about decks like this kind of synergy. One of the things that Affinity had a reputation for in Modern, and honestly, Affinity's child or grandchild hardened scales was similar, is just like you got to think about math a lot with this deck.
Yep.
And you really are looking for what some people might consider a sort of narrow band of plans that you're trying to do to maximize getting to in order to be successful with this deck. So I think it all starts with what I think we could call the dream scenario, right? So the dream scenario with this deck is you want to attack for lethal or a lot of damage almost as early as turn 3 in some of these. So I'm going to go through what it takes to do that. And you tell me if I have this wrong.
Sure.
So here's what I think the best plan is. Turn 1, Thraben Inspector or Voldaren Epicure. Get your 1/1, get a token. Turn 2, Gleeful Demolition, and Convoke Loxodon out with 4 creatures. So Knight Errant is good, but I think Loxodon is better because it makes you have 4 2/2s and a 4/4 going into turn 3. And then turn 3, you go Ornithopter, Bushwhacker, or you try to find some other spell that doesn't matter as much in Bushwhacker. But that means that if you're attacking on turn 3 in that scenario, it's probably 19-ish damage on turn 3.
That's a lot.
Right there. Right?
Not 20, but it's a lot.
It's 20. So if you get the Ornithopter, I think it's 20 or 21 power.
Yeah.
But that's the dream, right?
Yes, you're exactly right. In terms of mulliganing, you really the best opening hands include some way to an artifact, whether that's Inspector, Epicure, or Ornithopter, plus Gleeful. That's where you want to start. Those give you your most explosive starts.
So say that one more time. It's what? Yeah.
Artifact plus Gleeful.
Yeah, that's the best. Okay.
Yeah. And then, if you compare that, like you said, with a Convoke creature, it's weird because Frank mentioned in his article that he doesn't keep a hand without a payoff, which is, the Convoke Regis or Bushwhacker. But and maybe this is just matchup specific, but I found myself against Rakdos where I would just keep a hand that had, like a couple of 1-drops and a Gleeful Demolition, because the payoffs are not as good in against them, because they just, they're just going to Thoughtseize your payoff anyways. Right. So I found that just having more raw cards, like just card quantity, is better than card quality against them, because they're so good at trading 1-for-1.
Yep. Yeah, it's interesting. This is exactly what I wanted to ask you about, because, I did some probability math. I had a long discussion with ChatGPT trying to see if ChatGPT could do multivariate like probabilities for me. Guess what? It can't, so don't try. I actually had like an argument with ChatGPT when it gave me the wrong math, and I was like, "You're not doing this right." First off, Devon, can we talk about ChatGPT for a second? So first off, I went and I said, "Hey, do you understand Magic the Gathering?" And it said, "Yes, I do understand the rules of Magic the Gathering." I said, "Okay, I want to know probability of getting these 6 cards out of 9 cards from this 60 card deck." It followed that. Like it said, "Okay, give me the deck list." I gave it the deck list. It goes, "Okay, I'm thinking about these 60 cards." I was super impressed with that. Then I said, "Well, this is what I want to know. I want one of these 2 cards, one of this, blah, 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 blah. Tell me what the probability is of that." Then it explained how to do the problem, but didn't do the problem. It just told me how to do the problem. Yeah, it gave me the formula. And I said, "No, I want the math." Yeah. And it did this like 5 times. I had to tell it over and over again, "No, I want the real math." Then it finally did it, and I was looking at it, and it was like, okay, it's 1 out of every 770,000 draws is going to be the scenario that you and I described.
And I was playing a lot of games.
I was like, that ain't right, man. And I was like, so I went and found another website, and then I did it there. And it turns out the probability of getting that kind of like best draw that we were talking about is with 9 cards. So I gave us a couple of draws off the top to be able to, what's going into turn 3 is 6.9%. Like it's
it's not bad.
It's 1 in 14 games. Basically, you're going to have something that's close to that. Maybe I did my math wrong, because that doesn't sound that bad to me either, but it's still only 1 in like 13, 14 games. Right. But, and then,
that's fair.
I mean, as like the end of this, I was like, ChatGPT, go look at this multivariate calculator on this website, because it gave me the right thing. And then it said, "Oh yeah, just use that website to calculate it then." And I was like, thanks.
Thanks. I could have just done that the whole time.
Thanks a lot. By the way, the multivariate calculator I use is on a website called Deculator. It's deculator.appspot.com. I think that is correct. Felt better to me anyway. But so you were leaning towards after that whole, like, I wanted to talk badly about ChatGPT thing, you were leaning to the big question I had after playing this deck was, what kind of hands do I keep? Like, is it like Tron? Remember this, what you just described to me, the scenario that you described about, this is what I want to do against Rakdos. It feels like that's probably what you want to do, or what is the most plausible thing against many decks, is to kind of apply the thinking that people used to have from Tron, speaking of Tron from a couple minutes ago, which is like, you mull until you can make Tron. Like, that's what you want to do. It's not as hard and fast in this deck, but the idea that hands that have a lot of stuff going on are better than hands that have 2 payoffs or too many payoffs and a little bit of steam, it's probably better to be in that zone of like, well, I can get tokens, or I can go Thraben Inspector into Burning Tree Emissary into Forbidden Friendship. And even though I don't know where this is going, I have a good chance to draw one of my payoffs. Right. And so I think that's a great thing to talk about for a minute. So you mentioned that just as the best scenario against Rakdos, because of their inability to trade 1-for-1 and all those kind of, or not inability, but the fact that 1-for-1 trading isn't that good. Do you think that applies to more decks than that? Or do you think that it's basically like sometimes you want the big cards over the enablers?
I would say that probably applies to any of the decks that are trying to play fair. So Rakdos, blue-white. Are there really any other fair decks? Not really.
Yeah. I will
that's
say
really all we got, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, mono white humans is kind of a fair deck, right? Like, I mean, it's just creatures. It's fast, but it's just creatures.
The thing about that matchup is you kind of need, like, sizing is really important. So you really need to find a payoff, and you have to go fast against them because they can outsize you so quickly. So yeah, maybe that's a little bit different, but yeah, pretty much anybody that's trying to trade 1-for-1, like, well, I guess blue-white isn't necessarily trying to do that except for with counter spells, but mulliganing against blue-white, you feel the same as mulliganing against Rakdos because you're just down cards against them and you don't want to do that.
Yeah. Can I tell you a little bit of math, though? Another
Okay.
math. This is an easier math problem.
All right.
So I wanted to think about how likely am I to draw a payoff if I don't have one. So if I have a starting 7 without a payoff, your chances of drawing one of the 12 cards that we've defined as payoffs, Knight Errant, Venerated Loxodon, or Reckless Bushwhacker, is 55% if you give yourselves 3 draws. So
it's not bad.
It's a coin flip, right? Which is,
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people in poker and others, I mean, this is a deck where you want to get all in where it's slightly your advantage, I think. And Magic is that to some extent too. But this is the type of deck where I feel like if you're playing that kind of game where you're like, as soon as I have an advantage, I'm going to shove all in and try to end the game. Like, that feels like what this deck is. And it feels like that kind of thinking, you probably should just be making as many things as you can and hoping you draw into a payoff later is my take.
Right, and think about it this way. I'd rather have a hand that has no payoffs than a hand that has 3 payoffs. Like, you can't really keep a hand that's like 2 land, 2 creatures, and 3 convoke cards versus a hand that's just like 2 lands and 5 creatures / token makers. Like, I'd much rather have that hand because that hand sets you up better for those payoffs off the top of your deck.
Yeah. I mean, the big problem, and the reason I think you have to think this way too, is like it felt to me after playing this deck, and I'd love to see what you think about this, and you kind of hinted at this at the beginning of the discussion, this deck does not really have a backup plan, right? Like, it's not super easy to recover. You can. Knight Errant of Eos can help you recover. Legion's Landing can help you recover. You've crafted pieces into your list, and other people have it in their list to help with decks that have sweepers, basically. But if you play against the sweeper matchup wrong, you go a little too far in, you play one extra card that you should have kept in your hand, that's going to kill you, right?
Oh, yeah. You have to play, like, you have to play perfectly against, like, especially blue-white control that has the lockdowns, farewells, verdicts. Like, I did beat a blue-white control player who cast turn 3 lockdown, turn 4 verdict against me today in the challenge.
Whoa.
But yeah,
How?
It's just like, it's possible maybe they fired up the sweeper too early or anything like that. But yeah, you have to know how to sequence against them, and that's one thing that the really only you can learn by just a ton of reps against decks like that.
Yeah. And it's funny because on the one hand, I say that leads me down this path of, like you said, keep the enablers. You want hands that have strong enabler starts and don't care as much about the payoffs. But simultaneously, especially against blue-white or post-board against Rakdos, where you know they have extra sweepers, whatever sweepers they're going to use against you, like mass killing effects, it also doesn't mean that you're supposed to be reckless with your cards and just try to close the game as fast as possible. Right. It just means your goal is to have as much material on the board at a time as you can and hope that gets you through without overextending your hand and then finding yourself top decking later on, which is just, of course, brutal.
Yeah, this deck doesn't top deck. Especially post sweeper, this deck does not top deck very well.
Yeah. Any other things that you think about, like as far as when you're playing this deck, big picture concepts that you think people should keep in mind when they're trying to do this?
I mean, besides the math is just, like, I think the most important part, like, against the aggressive decks, like, figuring out how much, like, in terms of sequencing, like, do I play a Bushwhacker this turn, or is it better for me to, like, just play a couple 1-drops this turn and then Bushwhacker next turn? Mm-hmm. What if I draw a second Bushwhacker? The other difficult part is, like, on turn 3, if you, like, let's say you keep a hand that's just like a couple of creatures and some stuff, and you don't have a payoff yet, but then you amass, like, kind of, a 5 or 6 creature board, and then you draw a Knight Errant or something, or even a Loxodon. It's like, you have to figure out, do I want to use 5 creatures to convoke this and get in no damage this turn? Do I want to use 3 creatures to convoke this, get in some amount of damage this turn? Mm-hmm. In a general sense, if you're taking those lines, you almost always still want to tap 3, because 3 is the magic number that lets you hit Bushwhacker. And, right. The follow-up turn, Bushwhacker is important. So think about things like that, and just, like, especially sequencing against the sweepers. The other important thing is if Rakdos is still playing Extinction Event, which is something that I messed up when I was playing against Rakdos, is you want to use Loxodon to spread your power around to, like, say half of your creatures or half of your odd creatures or like if you're casting Luxodon, I should say, use 3 odd creatures and 2 even creatures, or something like that to spread the power around against stuff like the Extinction Event too.
Yeah. Yeah, you don't have too many even creatures. You have Burning Tree Emissary, you have Clarion Spirit, in certain builds you may have other things, but like that's another place where keeping some kind of 2-drop in here that's a creature is important, right? Well, I guess that 0 is even, right? Yeah, so your tokens are even. Yeah, so that makes sense. So correction, you have a lot of evens and not that many odds. Yeah. Sorry, don't send me emails, please. All right, so I mean, I think that's great. I mean, this is good, like high level conversation about the deck. We're kind of coming up on an hour in the episode. Let's talk about where this deck fits in Pioneer. And I think this is like a broad question about kind of like what this does in Pioneer, but also we can start to talk about matchups here, right? So people have been hyperbolic about the deck. They love it, hate it, ban it, forget about it. It's overrated. But what do you think that having this deck present in Pioneer right now is doing for the format, doing to the format? What do you think people are starting to think about this deck? Like, why do people care about this deck so much right now?
I mean, like, as much as I want to, say that this deck it's really awesome and it's super fun it's fun to play because I like winning, but it does at the end of the day kind of exacerbate the biggest issue in Pioneer, which is just a lot of high roll stuff going on. Like at the end of the day, this is extremely, people have compared it to like just running the slot machines or whatever, and it feels like that where you're trying to nut drop people as quickly as possible. But the one nice thing about it is it pressures the format in a way that people weren't necessarily doing before. Like the sweepers that Rakdos was playing, for example, the Extinction Events and Ritual of Soots, neither of those are like just lights out against this deck. Extinction Event, as we talked about, splits the creatures, and Ritual of Soot doesn't hit the Convoke creatures. So if you want to respect this deck and you want to be able to beat it, you have to really, really mean it, like the 3-mana sweepers. As far as matchups are concerned, like we talked about earlier, I do think this deck has a good Rakdos matchup, which is probably the biggest reason why people would want to play it. And the reason for that is because their cards are all so good at trading 1-for-1, but you present a lot of just stuff, like a lot of material,
Right.
You will frequently win games against Rakdos where you just go Inspector into Gleeful Demolition, and those 4 tokens just are good enough by themselves because all their removal is Fatal Push and Power Word Kill.
Yeah, and it's like, go ahead, spend 2 mana to get rid of my 3-Haven Inspector. Yeah. That's fine. Like, spend 2 mana to get rid of my Reckless Bushwhacker after it's already put, a +1/+0 on everybody for the rest of the turn, like all that kind of stuff. Yep.
And then it's also weird because, so I thought the mono green matchup was going to be pretty good because I've played a lot of decks similar to this in the past. Atarka Red had an incredibly good mono green matchup. These hyper linear aggressive decks usually have a good green matchup. And I have found myself kind of struggling against green. And I'm really not quite sure if it's like just the way that I'm approaching mulligan decisions, because it seems like what's happening is, if I don't have, the dream scenario of the Gleeful Demolition Convoke creature, they can present, like, obviously you can't kill an elf, like you don't have removal spells for elves, at least game 1. We could talk about the sideboard after, but
I want to talk about the torch guy too that people are trying out. What was up with that guy? Yeah.
So that's mostly a sideboard option for the green matchup, because when you want to be able to kill their elves, and that's how you steal the tempo back. But when they cast, an Old Growth Troll or Pelucranos on turn 2, you can't attack with, whatever you played in the first couple of turns, and they just have this, ability to just like keep putting stuff onto the battlefield. And if you don't go absurdly wide, it's really hard to beat them, until you get to the sideboard with the Magmatic Chasms and stuff like that.
Right. I heard you talking yesterday on stream about thinking about upping the Magmatic Chasms to 3. Did you do that? Oh, you did do that in your latest.
I did.
Your latest list. Actually, I'm flipping back over to it right now. Yeah, and that's really you really
thinking about it.
Yeah,
you have
and that's
to, you just have to draw that card against green.
Right. That's just all about green, really. Yeah. Interesting.
I think you could maybe talk me into bringing it in, like in the mirror/mono way, because it's like a similar situation where you're both just kind of staring at each other and neither player wants to attack. So it's like just a way to break board stalls.
Right. What about some of the other kind of not non-interactive comp, but this sort of like, I'm thinking about the broad group of decks that includes like Lotus and blue-red creativity, like these kind of spellsy combo-y decks. Like it seems like it's probably okay against Lotus Field, do you think? Or
Yeah, Lotus is by far your best matchup.
okay.
Lotus typically does struggle against these decks because there is a cap on how fast Lotus can kill, but they're also not interacting. And if they're not interacting with you, your fastest Goldfish kills roughly like an entire turn faster than theirs does.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I even felt like this was pretty good against creativity when I bring that up. Creativity is packing removal and has some other things going on as well. It also has counter spells, like things like, make disappear, and blue-white also has that, which I think is actually a card that can be kind of rough if you play into that. But it still felt like I was fast enough that creativity couldn't really keep up as much as maybe they want to. But what do you think about that?
I think that matchup is close. I played against it a couple of times. I've actually played against both versions, the Atraxa and the Torrential Gearhulk version. And I think that both of them are pretty close. So the issue with specifically the Torrential Gearhulk version, Magma Opus cleans up a lot of your stuff. Yeah. So if they can stave off the first wave and they get to Gearhulk Opus your entire board, it's really hard to come back from that.
Yeah,
unless you have like enough follow-up after the fact. Or Gleeful Demolition, again, as we talked about, kills Torrential Gearhulk, but the Opus leaves behind a 4/4, and you can't really interact with that.
Yep.
Now, against the Atraxa version, when I was playing Legion Loyalist, that card was instrumental against Atraxa because First Strike means that your creatures deal damage before they gain the life off of Atraxa. Without Legion Loyalist, it's been a little tougher. You do have Giant Killer. You do have some tools post-board against the Atraxa because they have to tap out for it, right? They have to main phase, tap out for the Atraxa. If you have a Giant Killer, then you win on the spot. But yeah, those matchups have been pretty close.
Yeah. Let's just talk about the rest of your sideboard now while we're here.
Sure. Okay.
So a couple of decks that I struggled against for what it's worth, and that might have been me, small sample size, etc. I did struggle against Greasefang, especially because game one, it feels like pretty tough to do anything against them. You can kill Greasefang with Giant Killer, right? But that's kind of it, right? Like if you don't have it, and they have it, you're just kind of toast, right?
Well, you can race, right? Like it's different because they actually do have cheap interaction. They play Fatal Push Thoughtseize sometimes.
Right.
So if they like, say turn one, Fatal Push your 1-drop to make it so you can't convoke onto, or Thoughtseize your convoke creature, and then they have, Enabler to Greasefang, you need, like, you can go wide where you just, you have like the Gleeful Bushwhacker is important in that matchup, right? Because you're trying to go wide. Their Greasefang turn presents 2 blockers, so you need to be able to, and you need to establish enough of a board plus Bushwhacker to be able to get past the finish line there. But yeah, that matchup gets a lot better after sideboard for sure.
Yeah, thanks to Rending Volley mostly, right? I mean, I guess you have Collective Effort right now, which that probably actually doesn't help against them.
No.
That's not Rending Volley is helpful.
We'll get to that in a second.
Yeah,
I think Rending Volley is just like the best sideboard card in Pioneer.
Yeah, it's an amazing card. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so that's Greasefang. So we've talked about Rending Volley. Obviously, what you're supposed to do with that. Forge Devil, we've talked about. You have 3 of that. I called it Torch Guy earlier. It's not that. He's Forge Guy. That's a 1/1 that deals 1 damage to target creature and 1 damage to you.
Forge Devil also being good in the mirror. Because you can, it's Forge Devil is not the most impactful card, but what its purpose is to steal the tempo back. Like you're playing this, you're killing their Epicure. It's a creature. It's also important that it's a creature so you can hit it off of Knight Errant. We've had End the Festivities in that spot before, but it not being a creature, I think, makes it a little bit worse.
Yep. Yeah. Totally makes sense. And it leaves a body behind so you can still Bushwhacker and have an extra creature. Yep. Okay, so we have those 2. We talked about Magmatic Chasm. Let's talk about Collective Effort. I'm going to bring up the text of that card. This card, when you told me about this card seems sweet. I always love this cycle of Escalate Rares from Eldritch Moon. There's some really good cards in there. I mean, Collective Brutality is in this set, as is Collective Defiance, which I think is a really cool card as well. But Collective Effort is generic white for a sorcery, and its Escalate cost is tap an untapped creature you control. Turns out we have a lot of creatures in this deck. And you can choose 1 or more for those modes. And the modes are destroy target creature with power 4 or greater, destroy target enchantment, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature target player controls.
So imagine a scenario real quick, Dave. Your Rakdos opponent, they go turn 3, Fable the Mirror Breaker. Turn 4, Shieldred the Apocalypse.
Right.
And on your turn, you go Collective Effort, tap 2 creatures, blow up your Shieldred, kill your Fable, put a counter on my team.
Yeah.
Does that sound like a card that you would enjoy?
It seems pretty good. It seems like it does so many things.
This card is absolutely absurd against Rakdos. Every time I've cast it, it's been a massive blowout. Your deck does... So the Rakdos matchup, while good, you can struggle with the card Shieldred. Because you kind of get into these spots where they're kind of like nickel and diming you, and Shieldred being the 4/5 body means that you can't even attack with your Convoke creatures, even if they've dealt with like the first wave and you have like a 4/4 to follow up. Right. So you need ways to be able to remove Shieldred, and this is a way to do that. That also has utility in other matchups, because destroying enchantments, good against temporary lockdown / leyline binding, so very good against the Fire's Incarnation decks, and also +1/+1 counter in your team that is permanent. It's not it's not like a Bushwhacker, you only get it for 1 turn. And sizing, creature sizing, board sizing is very important in the mirror as well.
Yep. And then the final card that you have in here is a card from is a battle that I think is starting to get more and more hype as time goes on, and that is Invasion of Gobekhan. So I'm going to read it. Invasion of Gobekhan is a generic and a white. It has defense 3, and it says, when Invasion of Gobekhan enters the battlefield, look at target opponent's hand. You may exile a non-land card from it. For as long as that card remains exiled, its owner may play it. A spell cast this way costs 2 more. That's the Paolo effect, basically, we're going to call that. I forget the Elite Spellbinder.
Yeah. Yep.
And then the back is Light Shield Array, and this is at the beginning of your end step, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature that attacked this turn. Seems good. And then sacrifice Light Shield Array. Creatures you control gain hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Also seems good. I had some trouble maximizing this card, I think, but I got to tell you, I completely forgot about that first line of text on the back side of it. I forgot that it pumps the team as well. And so it really is worth it to attack into this to get it. The front and back, different apples maybe are good against different decks, right? Or better against different decks than each other. Having access to what is like a quasi Thoughtseize on the front end, is that the way to think about it? Or are you almost always thinking about the back end on this?
No, you're mostly playing it for the front side.
Okay.
So the typical matchups where you want this in is against anybody who's heavy on sweepers. So Blue-White Control and Rakdos. They're gonna overload on sweepers post board. So making their sweeper cost 5 or 6 as opposed to 3 or 4 is obviously very massive.
Yeah.
And the backside also very relevantly. So the really cool thing about Invasion is you take their sweeper, which buys you a turn or 2 from them casting it, and then if you have some stuff on the battlefield, you get to flip the Invasion, which also blanks their sweeper, like if it's Verdict or whatever. So common play pattern is like you don't. So for those of you who are playing this card, you don't usually want to play it on turn 2, because if you're playing it, like even if you have like say a 3-bit Inspector on turn 1 and then you play this on 2, you can't flip it the next turn unless you have like a Bushwhacker draw. So maybe there are some hands where you would do that, but the most common line of play is like stuff on 1, more stuff on 2, play this, take their best card, immediately flip it, get a counter on all my stuff, and now your best card is 2 turns out as well.
Right. And maybe it doesn't even work anymore because I'm just going to sacrifice this instead to stop it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Card just it does it all. And there have been the nut draw is turn 1 Ornithopter Gleeful, turn 2 play this, take your thing, flip it immediately because you get 3 power off the Demolition. I've done that a couple of times, and it's just like the game's just over on the spot.
That is unbelievable. All right, can we talk a little bit about what we take out? I know it's matchup dependent. But I just want to check like my own thinking on this deck. So obviously we're not taking out any of the core cards. We're not. Do we ever shave on Convokes? Are you shaving on Convokes sometimes?
Oh no. Well, it is matchup dependent. So against the linear decks like Green, Lotus Field, anything where you don't expect to play more than like 3 or 4 turns, maybe 5 tops, I usually shave on Knight Errant of Eos because you, one, cannot afford to get flooded on Convoke creatures because you barely have time to cast the first one in those types of matchups.
Right.
And obviously Luxodon's a lot better because it helps you put more power into the battlefield, gets them dead quicker. So I will frequently shave copies of those in like just the Knight Errants in the linear matchups.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. But otherwise, it's mostly swapping flex cards, right? So we're kind of like, we're taking out giant killers, putting in giant killer. Well, you don't have any more giant killers in your sideboard anymore. Earlier this week you did. Taking out Legion's Landing occasionally for Magmatic Chasm. That's kind of the general process, right?
Yeah, sometimes against Rakdos, like the decks that have more, like the decks that have more interaction, sometimes I'll shave down on like, I'll shave an Ornithopter, I'll shave a Burning Tree Emissary, just because I want my card quality to be a little bit higher in those matchups. Like, I know that we're playing a bunch of bad cards, but I want to, as much as I can, try to upgrade the card quality a little bit because I love invasion in those matchups. So, the typical plan against Rakdos is like shave a Thopter, shave a Burning Tree, cut the Clarion Spirit, cut 2 Forbidden Friendships, cut... What was the other card I was cutting? I think I might have been cutting an Epic here too, like shaving on the artifact package, just bringing in the 6 white cards.
Yep. That makes sense. That's similar to what I was doing, except for I was never taking the 1-drops out. Basically, it was always kind of playing around the flexes on the edges. Yep. Okay, awesome. So you've been playing this deck for a couple weeks. You're going to Dallas.
Yep.
You're going to play this deck in Dallas. Like, that's not a secret, right?
100%.
Okay, 100%
Unless,
on this deck.
So I'm going to play it. So for those of you who don't know the LCQ structure, they're kind of just fill and fire. They're 32 person. So, I'll play a couple with this. Maybe if the first like 2 or 3 don't go well, maybe I'll, have like break in case of emergency break glass type of thing, which would probably be Greasefang. But yeah, I will play this deck for at least like 2 or 3 LCQs.
Okay. Yeah, that's
hopefully
awesome.
Just one.
Well, yeah, I mean, in that sense, if they're fill-in fires, and are they single a limb, or are they're single a limb too? So, like you said, if we're playing for the high roll, like let's play for the high roll and kind of like try to get that. You're trying to like League 5-0 basically with 32 people, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So I like it. I think that's a great place to start. And then if you do last chance into the RC. You're probably thinking about this too, just because you've got so many reps at this point, or what do you think? At that point, you're just going to figure it out.
I would still play this probably.
Okay.
It's gonna take me a lot to get off of this deck. Like it will take the Rakdos players playing like 4 Hitotsugu Consume Sol, and then I'll be like, okay, maybe I'll think about something else.
I'm going to do something different. Let's talk about the meta a little bit that you expect, and part of the reason that I want to talk about it is just because you must be thinking about this deck in the context of kind of what we expect to see. So we're going to really quickly talk about the LMS Valencia.
LMS, yep.
Yeah, so it's a different kind of tournament series. This is their equivalent of, my understanding is that this is like a large RCQ. It's not an RC. These are people qualifying for next season's RC, I believe.
Correct. This is kind of what this feels to me is like the European NRG.
Yep. Okay. Totally makes sense. So this is a big tournament, good amount of people. Let's just go through this pretty quickly because we are kind of creeping on in time wise as we always do when we talk to each other on the dive down.
Thought we were here all night.
Yeah, exactly. We'll be here all night. We're gonna live stream after this. Okay, top of the list, obviously Rakdos mid. Oh, actually, really quickly before we get into this, I do just want to say some of our listeners. Mickey S, who I think is one of the mods in your Twitch channel, actually, too, Devon, was
Turtle
going
Power,
through. Right? Yeah, Turtle Power was going through the deck list and found a lot of deck reg kind of mistakes.
Oh, I found a couple of those too. Yeah.
So this is not 100% accurate. We would have Shane go through this and normalize the data, but he's got a broken wrist. It looks like
he could just use his other wrist.
Exactly. Come on, it only takes one click, and we're only clicking the mouse with one hand. The Anil Yahi has also posted some of this data. I don't know. This is someone that we've talked about from Twitter a few times.
I'm familiar, yeah.
Anil has also said he's going to go through and normalize this data, so take a look around over the next couple of days. However, we're going to use this knowing that some of this isn't quite right.
One thing real quick before we start, I saw somebody in the deck list, they labeled their deck as Vanifar combo, and I was unbelievably excited, and then I clicked on the deck list and it was just Rakdos.
Are you serious? I thought it was the other way around. Mickey made it sound like it was the other way around in Discord. I thought that he said that it was someone who labeled as RB and it was actually Vanifar combo.
No, I was heartbroken.
And now I'm heartbroken again, all over again, after being more excited. That's funny. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to talk. We have two pieces of data. We have the meta share on day one, and we have the conversion rate of the players playing this deck who converted into day two. Rakdos mid. We knew it was going to be number one. It's 21% of the meta. And 18% of those players converted into day 2, according to this uncorrected data. 18% is pretty respectable conversion rate, I think, right? Like, we probably want to set the baseline there at like 10 to 15 is pretty good for day 2, right?
Well, that's what I was thinking. Like, if it's a fifth of the field and a fifth of those players make it, that's like, that seems to be like, that would be the expectation, right? At least if it's 21%, let's get this out of the way. 21% of the metagame, that's a lot. That's
absurd.
A fifth of the field.
Yeah.
So, you have to maybe temper the expectations a little bit, where you maybe would expect the conversion rate to be slightly higher because it has that higher representation.
Yeah. But this isn't composition of day 2. This is just the number of those people that made day 2, because the numbers for day 2 are even all over the place, right? So if for example, if 20% of a fifth of the field converts to day 2, it's actually more than 20% of the day 2 field, because the number of players is lower.
Right.
But 21% is freaking wild. The way that I want to bring this up, the reason why, and I think the way that we should talk about this meta is, since we've been talking about Boros this whole time, let's just talk about it through the lens of Boros. You're pretty happy if the meta is 20% Rakdos, right? As long as they don't tack too hard against Convoke, like you said, you're pretty happy with that.
I think so. I mean, I've played the matchup. That's definitely the matchup I played the most over the past 2 weeks, and I didn't track my exact win rate, but I would have to say I'm like probably over, it's over 60% against them, maybe slightly less, but yeah, I'm pretty happy with those numbers.
So that's kind of a tick mark, and like, this is a good thing to play Convoke. We like it.
Unless they, like you said, unless they really want to beat you.
Yeah. Next on the list is Monogreen Devotion with 8.85. That was in second place. 23.53% of those players converted from day 1 to day 2. It's a pretty good conversion rate. It's a higher conversion rate than Rakdos Mid. It's one of the highest ones that we have on the list.
Wow. That's a big number. I didn't even realize that.
Yeah.
Oh, boy.
1/4 of those people made it. Monogreen's back. Pelucranos is back.
Yeah, Pelucranos is really good. You guys have talked about this a bunch of times in the pod, but that card just like fixes so many of your matchups. It makes the Greasefang matchup like close to, if you have Pelucranos and they can't kill it, then they just can't even attack profitably with a Parhelion. Makes your Spirits matchup better. It's just like that card is so sick.
Yeah. So we're probably going to see a good amount of monogreen. I wouldn't be surprised if people looked at this and it ticked back up into that 10%. I also think in America, people seem to, at these RCs, these Pioneer RCs, people seem to love monogreen Devotion. I wouldn't be surprised if it was over 10% of the field again, especially when we look at the RC versus what we might see, especially these last chance qualifiers. But who knows? So monogreen's going to be there. You said you've been struggling against it a little bit, but it's only 8% of the field, 10% of the field, so not too scary. But something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I'll bring the Magmatic Chasms. Like I said, I'll probably end up registering 3 of those.
Yeah.
Maybe I know that I was going to test with somebody, off stream, and just see if they could maybe just play a couple of games with me. They play Monogreen, I play this deck, and see if we can make something else. I was thinking about, there's another card I was going to try. I don't know if you remember this card, Fire Fist Striker. Do you remember that one, Dave?
I don't remember that card. Where's that from? Is that from?
It's from Gatecrash. Generic red 2/1, and then Battalion something can't block.
I mean, I remember playing that card in draft, now that you talk about it, because Battalion was my jam in that format. Boros was extremely good in Gatecrash Limited.
Yeah, I went real deep on the creature can't block, but yeah, I'll have to see if that works. But yeah, I don't know. I have to play the matchup a little bit more. Maybe it's just like I said, maybe I'm not taking aggressive enough mulligans. Maybe I'm keeping more average hands, and I should just be like really aggressively mulliganing to those nut draws. But yeah.
Yeah, Azorius Control is next on the list. 8.59% on Azorius Control. I don't know if these people were paying attention to what happened in Energy a couple of weeks ago, where it was a UW mirror in the finals. But here's the thing about Azorius Control: 3.03% of those people converted to day 2, which means one person out of the entire group. Yeah, it's extremely atrocious. It's unbelievable. I mean, 3% is like 30 people came with it, and only one person made it to day 2, basically.
That's pretty bad.
Yeah.
I wonder if it was just, really hostile towards Azorius. It's so weird. I've seen a lot of discourse between like the Azorius versus Rakdos matchup. I'm fairly certain that Rakdos is a significant favorite against them, unless like maybe Yorion factors into that. But so it's not surprising to see like such a huge percentage of Rakdos, and then the conversion rate of Azorius kind of mimicking that.
Yeah. All right. Is it creativity? But sorry, before we go on, but as far as Convoke goes, it's a tough matchup, but you feel like you have a good line on it, right? Especially with Gobakon and some other tools that you have.
This is probably the worst matchup for the Convoke deck.
Okay.
I think I've been like right around splitting, maybe less than splitting my matches against them. I've probably played it maybe 10 or 12 times. Matchup is tough, but like you said, gets a lot better post board. Invasion of Gobakon buys you a lot of time against Supreme Verdict. Their counter spells like absorb in the later in the game. Their counter spells aren't that great, so yeah, it's not terrible, but it's not the matchup that I'd want to play.
Right. All right. Is it Creativity's next after that? We don't have, as you mentioned in the notes here to us, we don't know if it's Gearhulk, Atraxa, Worm, other things. 7% of the field day one, 26% of those people basically converted to day two. Pretty good conversion rate as well. That's the second highest conversion rate we have on here.
Yeah, no, that is pretty good. And I think a lot of that would lead me to believe that most of these lists are probably playing Gearhulk, because I think the Gearhulk version is significantly better against Rakdos than the Atraxa or Worm versions. So would not be surprised if a lot of these players are playing Gearhulk.
Yeah. Yeah. But how do you feel about, is it Creativity versus, like we talked about, you said the Gearhulk one you feel pretty good about against, right?
I think no matter what version they're playing, it's a super close matchup. Make Disappear on Convoke creatures is kind of a beating. Like if they're on the play and they have turn 2, Make Disappear. But if again, it's just a lot of it's die roll. If you win the die roll and you have the Convoke creature, they can't really stop that for the most part. So yeah, it feels like one of those matchups that's like die roll game 1, and then Invasion helps you a lot post board.
Yeah. Yeah. Odds on Greasefang, 5.5% of the meta, 9.52% of those people converted to day 2. So low conversion rate out of Greasefang. I think that maybe that just means that you don't have to worry about it. And so we could probably leave that one for now.
I don't think that matchup is too bad. I feel, again, it's probably one of those coin flip matchups, but I think you have a higher chance. Like your deck can do things on the draw that even if they have the turn 3 Parhelion, that you can still beat. Like if you have the Gleeful plus Convoke creature or plus Luxodon on the draw, even if they have Parhelion, you could still beat that draw.
Yep. Lotus Field, 3.91%. A third of those people converted to day 2. So high conversion rate, but low number of people on day 1. That likely means that there was 13 people on it, 13, 14, 12 kind of people on it. So that's 4 or 5 people making it into day 2, which is pretty interesting. Lotus Field is just like that sometimes, though, right? We see these events quite frequently where all of a sudden Lotus Field comes up, and on the individual matchups, it just kind of crushes it, but it never gets to like broader adoption overall. But this is your best matchup, as you said.
Yes, this is definitely the matchup I want to play the most. It almost feels like Dredge. Just going back to Lotus in general, it's just like people don't respect it for one weekend. It's like, oh, here's Lotus, I'm still here.
Right. Or Affinity in a weird way. Remember when that used to happen? It was like, do I bring the Stony Silences? Do I not bring the Stony Silences?
Yeah, exactly.
Mono white humans. We haven't talked about mono white humans a ton. We've kind of mentioned in passing a couple times. 13.3% of the meta, 15% of those people converted.
3.
So that's likely 1 or 2 people maximum that made it from day 1. I believe that there was someone who was undefeated on day 1 on mono white humans, actually.
That sounds about right. Yeah, I think there was.
Yeah. What do you think about this matchup?
I think I've generally been pretty happy with it. And, you go a lot wider than they do, and they don't have, a ton of, like, their only interaction is, like, Ossification Brotocathar, which, again, not that great against the tokens. That stuff is good against the Convoke creatures, but if you have Luxodon, you're leaving a ton of power behind on the battlefield, and at least the games that I've played, it seems to get into these board stalls where neither player wants to attack, but you have ways to, like, go so much wider than they do with Bushwhacker, so I think it's a good matchup.
Okay. Good to know. You think it's done okay lately, and so it's probably going to be around the same in Dallas right now.
Yeah, I this sounds about right. Maybe it's slightly higher. Maybe it's like closer to 4 or 5%, but this is about what I would expect. Yeah.
Got it. All right. Next deck on the list is Boros Convoke, which actually we realized this is one of the things we realized in the data is that the listing on the this organization's Boros Convoke was actually, it says 3.39%, but there was another deck on their entries called Boros Aggro.
Yeah.
It was, I believe it was closer to 5.5% or so, and 16% of those people converted from day 1 to day 2, which means 3 out of 15, I think is what we're talking about here.
That sounds about right. Yeah.
Yeah. 3 out of 18. I think it's actually 3 out of 18 players converted to day 2. So, hype deck. Maybe the hype hasn't reached Europe yet because it's not, I would expect people to bring this out a little bit more in force. Also, given that this deck is not like the most expensive thing in the world to build, I don't think, in paper.
After this weekend, maybe that might not be true anymore.
Tough to say. Yeah, tough to say. I know that Invasion of Gobakon is like 25 tickets.
Just going to mention that. Yeah, it spiked in paper too. It's like, I think it's like 15 in paper.
Woof. Okay. Gonna have to get some of those at some point, I'm sure. So what do you think about this? Do you think that people are gonna, given the Twitter discourse, given what's going on in Magic Online, do you think you're gonna get 10% show up with this and just try to pedal the metal, or what do you think?
When I initially started playing the deck and I saw all of the discourse on Twitter, I think my guesstimate was somewhere between 8 to 10% would be my guess for the metagame in Dallas. Maybe a little bit lower and be like closer to 7%, but I don't think it'll break 10%.
Okay. So it's going to be a tier 2 deck by meta representation. It's not going to suddenly bust into being like Boros Convoke and Mono Green Devotion are both 10%, and then everything else is going to fall after that. Yeah.
No,
okay.
It's not going to get anywhere close to that because, there are a lot of people, as we've seen the Twitter discourse, there are a lot of people who also don't believe that it's even a playable deck.
Right.
But yeah, I think it'll somewhere in the middle, probably, like I said, 7-8%.
Yeah. So what about the mirror, Devon?
You got a coin handy? Just flip it.
Yeah.
That's pretty much what it is. I mean, it gets weird. There's like I've talked about a couple of times. There's these weird board stalls where neither player wants to attack because you're always worried about like, okay, well, what if they have Bushwhacker? How much can they deal in the crackback? And you have to like leave exactly enough creatures to play around them having like 2 creatures plus Bushwhacker. There's a lot of math involved, and I don't like math that much. But yeah, it's a weird matchup.
I mean, you got to do your combat math when you're playing this deck. Like you said, you have to know like how much your chip damage is. Like you said, you have to plan ahead a couple of turns. This is the experience of playing this deck did remind me a little bit of some of the things that I love the most about certain formats in Limited, which is just like, okay, I need to think really fast about how much of my material on board can I sacrifice to push through damage, still take a crackback, and then also still continue to win. And it's like, well, wait, is it this? Is it that? Is it this? What if they have this? Yeah. Fortunately, we're the only deck in Pioneer that can really drop that much damage that fast. So you don't have to think too much about really crushing things. But there are occasional decks where suddenly it's like, okay, well, what if they land a Traxa, on this next turn? Like, what happens then? Mostly you die. But there's, there's things that can help. But yeah, I found that these mirrors to be kind of weird as well and interesting.
Super interesting.
Yeah. All right, 2 more decks to talk about really quickly before we kind of wrap this up. Dimir Control. This is not a real deck, right?
Yeah,
like,
I don't know.
Not real or just around very much, right?
I'm not really sure why it's even 2%. To be honest with you, I'm very surprised. Maybe they were mislabeled as Aureus decks, but
yeah. So we'll skip that one. We haven't been expecting this kind of deck in Pioneer. We haven't seen it on Magic Online lately. Maybe there's a contingent of people in Europe who like to play Control. Like maybe Wafo and like a couple of other French Control people were there, and they're just like, we're bringing Dimir. We don't even care. It's fine. Gruul Vehicles is the last one on here. 2%. Only 12% of those people made it into day 2. So not like a great showing from Gruul Vehicles either.
Yeah, can we talk about that real quick? Like,
sure.
Gruul Vehicles, 2-3 months ago was what, like the 3rd or 4th most played deck, and now it's all the way at the bottom. Like, what the heck happened? And it's also even more shocking to me because the Rakdos just keeps increasing in popularity, and that was Gruul's best matchup. So maybe it's just that people aren't playing it anymore.
Yeah. Well, I mean, or it can be one of those things where like regionally things are just not that popular.
Maybe.
Right? Yeah. And I guess another thing I would ask is, what is Gruul's matchup against like Azorius Control, and is it creativity?
Well, those matchups are horrible.
Yeah.
So I guess that makes sense.
That could be part of it too. Is as those ascend, this one goes further down. But you never know. Like, this is one of those things. I mean, Gruul was one of the breakout decks of the RCs in fall, essentially. And so it could be that people just pick it back up and are ready to go over here in the States. And you never know. What do you think about the Boros matchup?
Well, I haven't played it yet. I guess
Okay.
there's just not been a lot of Gruul. Looking at the deck list, I would have to imagine that Boros is probably a big favorite because like their curve of like Elf into Stormseeker into Chariot, you can just tank all of the hits from that, and you're racing them. They don't have a ton of interaction. They can't kill a 4/4. So I would have to imagine that's a really, really good matchup for Boros.
I did struggle a little bit with a Resolved Chariot, I will say. And
Did you?
I
Okay.
played against red green. They did not Stormseeker me, so it wasn't like a fast one, but it was kind of like I wasn't fast
Defensive.
enough. Yeah, and then they just had cats, and then they were like, they were activating the Chariot, and it was kind of like, oh my god, can I even attack anymore? I think that part of that was, though, I hadn't had this wonderful discussion with you about what to keep and what to mull. That was only like my third match, maybe. So I was really like, do I keep Burning Tree Emissary, Giant Killer, Ornithopter, land? I don't know. Like, I'm just trying whatever at that point. So I might have just had a bum hand in that way as well. But Chariot did feel rough to me. Also, I played against Obzon Greasefang a couple of times where they resolved Chariot. It was just like an extra stop sign other than the Angels as well. So it was like, even though they didn't get Parhelion on board, they were like, okay, now we're just going to cast this, and then you have to stop.
Yeah, gum up the board.
Yeah. So we'll see. Chariot seemed, because, it's one of those things where, like, it makes extra tokens too.
Yeah,
so,
that's true.
Yeah. All right. So given all this, how are you feeling about Boros in this context? Pretty good still?
I think I'm pretty good. If Rakdos is the most played deck, if Rakdos is 20% of the metagame, if that number stays the same, I would have to, if you tell me I'm going to play against, so let's assume for the sake of argument, the RC, let's assume I qualify, win an LCQ. Their RCs are what, like 15 rounds? So a fifth of that, play against Rakdos 3 times. I'll take these numbers. The Azorius control matchup is a little sketchy sometimes. But other than that, I feel pretty confident.
Awesome. All right. I think you should feel confident too, but mostly because you're you. I think this deck is good. I think this deck is fine. Like, as far as if you want to know, like, my take on it, everybody, at the end of this conversation, I really enjoyed playing this deck. Devon, you probably know I'm a big like prowess player. I really love to play these kind of like synergistic aggro decks.
Yeah.
A deck like this, to me, it misses like Lightning Bolt, of course. Which would be nice to have a little bit of extra reach and a little bit of extra interaction.
For now, it misses Lightning Bolt.
For now, it does. Yeah, we'll see. Pioneer Masters, here we go. But I think this is a totally solid deck. I think the deck building is really impressive. Like, the fact that over the last few weeks, so many different people in the community have kind of picked up, what you had kind of said was maybe an idea that started with a list that Everett tried in Modern, and then people said, well, wait, let's try to do this in Pioneer. And, you were one of those people, and it seems like a couple of other people picked up the mantle pretty quickly as well there too. I think that's almost the most interesting thing to me about this. I would definitely play this deck on like a Friday night when I want to have fun, and I'm like, I want to think, but I don't want to think about certain other really complex interactions in Magic. I really want to think about like how to maximize the potential of my own hand, how to be tricky and get around what my opponent's doing. So I think this is a good deck for people who like to play like that for sure. And honestly, Loxodon and Knight Errant are really cool cards. I'm glad that they found a home. Convoke is a powerful mechanic. I'm glad that we have something that is using Convoke that's not just Quarter Calling. So I think there's a lot of positive things going on for this deck. So I would definitely play it again. My results, I did 2 leagues with it. I went 4 and 6. Including winning 2 mirrors, which is really weird. But, it is what it is.
Yeah, but maybe just matchups. One thing before we end the podcast, I want to go on record. And say, for this deck, it's not Hogak, okay? People need to stop talking about this. It is cool that it exists within the Pioneer format. It's awesome when decks like this kind of pop out on the scene, because Pioneer, for the most part, is like becoming, at least people are kind of thinking that it's been a little bit stale lately. So anytime you get a new deck to burst onto the scene that happens to, have a good weekend, it's awesome. But, at the end of the day, deck is relatively inconsistent. You have to gamble a little bit sometimes, but it's fun. I enjoy it,
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. There's nothing to me about playing with this deck or against this deck in the last 4 or 5 days that really makes me feel like it's Hogak in any way, shape, or form.
No.
At all. Yeah, I mean, it's just like not even close. I get why people are frustrated by these big bursty openings, but like think about the inverse, like all the hands that people playing this deck open up to. That's Thraben Inspector, Voldaren Epicure, and then like 2 lands and a Bushwhacker, and you're like, keep, I guess. You know,
I'm mulligan a lot today.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about how to mulligan with this deck, but we did not talk about how much you mulligan. I mulligan to 5 quite frequently playing this deck in the league, the 2 leagues that I did.
Yeah, you kind of have to.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Devon. Well, best of luck to you next week. Safe travels, all those kind of stuff. We'll be happy to talk to you. Excited to talk to you when you come back, just to like hear how it goes, hear how the experience went, hear how Everett treats you as a house guest. I bet he's very nice.
He is. Yeah, and I miss his dogs.
He does have great dogs. Yeah, that's true. But that wraps up this week's show. And if you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to our podcast so you get the latest episodes as soon as they come out. And if you use Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. If you'd like to submit a question to the podcast or reach out, you can tweet at us at The Dive Down or email thedivedown@gmail.com. If you want to support the show, check out our Patreon, patreon.com/thedivedown. Check out our store, divedown.com/store. If you want any of this stuff at any time, it's all posted on thedivedown.com, by the way. There's a banner right in the middle that gives you all the codes, all those things. Like, check that out. Shout out to Mana Traders for sponsoring the Dive Down. Sign up for Mana Traders using promo code the Dive Down 2023, all one word, for 10% off your first 2 months of renting Magic Online cards. Get your amazing shaving soaps, body fragrances, body soaps, and more at Barrister and Mann using the Dive Down M23. That's a new code, as we mentioned earlier, for 15% off your first order. And save money at paper cards at Nerd Rage Gaming with code DIVE8 for 8% off your order. As always, special thanks to the bands Nowhere and Space Blood for letting us use their music. And until next week, get out there and get 12 to 14 power on turn 2.